We've learnt about environments and how the environment is made up of the biotic factors and the abiotic factors. The living and the non-living. And when we talk about the biotic factors, there's a whole lot of categories we can use to explain how do living things interact with each other. So we're going to learn about all these different types of interactions or relationships and how they affect each species. So the first interaction, and actually the first two interactions, these are short-term interactions. Because they happen as a one-off event, or the organisms work together for a short time and then they go off and do their own thing again. So the first short-term interaction is called cooperation, or sometimes it's called collaboration. And we can see an example of cooperation here. We've got a pod of dolphins that are all working together and helping each other to hunt some fish, which is their prey. So cooperation means just what it does in everyday life, where individuals help each other so they all benefit. So if we think about the two different species in cooperation, the first species benefits, it has a positive, and the second species benefits as well. Two positives. The next short-term interaction is called predator-prey interaction. And we all remember that when a predator and a prey interact, the predator animal comes along and it eats its prey. So in this case, the predator benefits. It gets a delicious meal and it gets energy to help it survive. But obviously the prey has a negative outcome. It's harmed and it dies. The prey always dies in a predator-prey interaction. The next types of interactions, these are all long-term and really close interactions. And the name we give all these long-term interactions is symbiosis. So if you ever hear symbiosis, just think long-term relationship between living things. So the first long-term relationship is called a mutualism. And in mutualism, each species helps each other. Just like in collaboration, but it's over a long period of time. So the species or the individuals help each other. Here's an example, two examples of mutualism. When bees pollinate flowers, they get to eat the pollen and the nectar, and the flowers benefit as well because they get pollinated and that lets them reproduce. And clownfish can also hide in sea anemones, which gives them protection from predators, and the sea anemone gets cleaned because the clownfish eat the algae off the sea anemone. So mutualisms, both species benefit. Two positives. Next we have commensalism. And in commensalism, one species benefits and the other species doesn't care either way. They don't gain and they're not harmed either. So one benefits, the other has no effect. And here's a great example of commensalism, which is these birds. When water buffalo walk through marshland and swamps, they bring up lots of insects that live in the swamp and they come up to the surface. And these birds, they ride along the back of the buffalo, and then when insects get brought up, they fly down and feed on the insects. So they get a free meal out of following along the buffalo. And the buffalo, they don't mind either way. They're not affected by some birds riding on their back. The next symbiosis is called parasitism. So when a parasite lives on its host. Parasite lives in its host or on its host. And the parasite benefits because it feeds on its host, but the host is harmed. So the parasite feeds on the host, and the host, it either becomes sick or it has less energy available. So parasitism, one species benefits and the other one is harmed. The next example is called competition. And nearly every species in its habitat is competing with other species. It might be competing for light, like in these, with all these plants on the forest floor, or it might be competing for water, like all these zebras and wildebeests in Africa. So in the environment, there's usually a resource that different species compete for. So organisms compete for resources. And because both species use energy to try and access those resources, they both are harmed with competition. So competition, there's no winner. The last example of symbiosis is called amensalism. And in amensalism, one species is harmed, but the other species isn't affected at all. So this usually happens when one species releases chemicals that harm another species nearby. One species harms nearby organisms. A couple of examples are some fungi, when they grow, they release chemicals that kill any bacteria nearby. You can see on the agar plate here, there's a gap where no bacteria can grow. And some trees, their roots release chemicals into the soil that make it harder for other trees to grow. So we have this large adult tree and it's slowing its neighbours. It's slowing their growth. So these are all the types of symbiosis, the long-term interactions and the short-term interactions between living things.